I'm Dr. Jacquelyn Schneider. I am an assistant professor at the Naval War College. I'll be moving to the Hoover Institution in the fall at Stanford University. I've been working in the cyber domain for officially about 6 years. So I started my career as an active duty intelligence officer in the Air Force. And my last assignment was doing some more kind of technical, specific intelligence. And then I went off to get my PhD, and I was looking at the when and why states go to war. And I kept coming back to this cyber thing as a persistent problem. I said, I don't understand. What is this thing? How does it affect whether or not states go to war? And it felt like there was a really interesting intellectual puzzle. At the same time that I was getting my PhD at George Washington, I also started a reserve job at U.S. Cyber Command. And so the combination of having the rich intellectual environment at George Washington, where we were trying to understand conflict, and also being immersed in the very rich policy discussion that was happening at Cyber Command at the time, really piqued my interest. And so since then, about 6 years, I've been working specifically at looking at the role that cyber operations play in the in instability and stability, decisions to go to war, how it affects deterrence, how it affects escalation. So I think what's been really fascinating to me working on cyber and escalation is I came to this project really worried about how cyber operations were going to affect instability dynamics. All the core theories of international relations look at the attributes of cyberspace, the uncertainty, the difficulty with attribution, the lack of precedent about responses to cyberspace, and the potential for cyberspace creating large-scale effects that affect civilian populations. All these characteristics which suggest that cyber operations are by their nature destabilizing. But as I started working on this project and I started running war games and conducting survey experiments and trying to collect empirical evidence to support the assumptions that I came to the problem with, I started finding that cyber operations actually are framed fundamentally differently by the individuals that I was working with. Instead of cyber operations being unstable, it actually created a sense of anxiety. Instead of fear, it caused individuals to stop and have kind of a friction response. And so what's been interesting about my work in cyberspace and escalation is that I found that these operations are more likely to create a space for individuals to slow down, to rethink, and if they want to de-escalate, it allows the space, the uncertainty allows the space to de-escalate. Now, most of my work has been conducted with Americans. I'm currently working on a project where we compare international responses. So I have war games looking at players all over the world with Americans. And so that'll be interesting to see how much of what I found so far is an American response to cyber operations and how much is all just about human behaviors and how we as humans respond to this emerging technology. We're seeing an outcry within civilian institutions and military institutions to think about cyber at a graduate level. So students want to take those classes. And I think institutions across the board have not really understood what it is that people want or what they need. So we at the Naval War College, we generally work kind of at the strategic level. And so when they came to us and said, you need to have cyber inside PME, our first thought was, well, what does that mean for strategy? So where I've seen a lot of success happening in terms of the Naval War College's perspective is instead of investing a lot of resources and trying to teach our officers who come to us between the level of kind of 03 and 06 how to have fingers on the keyboard, instead we're trying to give them enough information about the technical to be able to make these like large strategic decisions. And then really focusing on how cyberspace operations affect the work that they would do in operational staffs or the work that they would do in service staffs to try and allocate resources and figure out campaign plans. So I've seen that, that transition from thinking about cyber as something that has to be studied on a range or on a keyboard to thinking about something about how it relates to Clausewitz or Mahan or just kind of campaign plans in general as being a real progress in terms of graduate study. There's a really great book by Bob Jervis called Perceptions and Misperceptions in International Relations. And one of the chapters, he actually looks at the analogies that decision makers draw from when they're making decisions in crises. And so that's kind of the fault and the potential opportunity of using analogies to understand cyber is they provide us with a heuristic that takes something that is novel and places it within the context of something we understand that helps us make decisions. But if used incorrectly, if we don't evaluate the analogies, it also leads us to make a series of bad decisions based on poor analogies. So you have to have this interaction with the analogy where you're constantly trying to understand the utility of the analogy, the extent that you can apply it, and the extent that it just derails you and puts you on the wrong decisions. I mean, the cyber Pearl Harbor analogy really kind of stymied a lot of the cyber strategic development for years because that was the context in which we thought about cyberspace. And you can see in the development of operations the heavy role that the airspace analogy and the air tasking order played in the initial decisions about how we were going to execute cyber operations, right? We were trying to put it within the analogy of the joint planning process and the way we task airframes. And I think what you see now, if you go and listen to General Nakasone, is you see actually experimentation that's occurring with these task forces. And that's something that is outside the analogies of our joint planning process. So that's kind of interesting because we've moved on from the analogy in some ways and is starting its own kind of development.